Mrs. Olu Verheijen, Special Advisor to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu on Energy. Thank you so much for joining this Arise exclusive. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I know we've been trying to do this for such a long time, but I guess no surprises. You've been so busy in the last 2 years. Looking at the sort of policy and directives coming out of the government, we were like, she's been really, really busy, and I hope we'll get to talk a bit about that today. But congratulations on some of the milestones so far.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I guess that leads me to my first question, which is really around what is the Nigerian government's strategy for the energy sector?
It's really simple, and I like to say that, even though it's a complex execution, but it's really to leverage all of our abundant energy resources to drive economic growth and diversification, to eradicate energy poverty, and to create high-paying jobs for millions of Nigerians.
Yeah, it sounds very simple.
It is simple.
But maybe not really reflecting the complexities of trying to navigate policy in the energy sector. So what would you say the government's strategic imperatives are right now, today?
So there are a few levers that we're trying to prove as strategic levers to execute that very simple strategy. One is the elimination of regressive and wasteful energy subsidies that are become such a drain on our fiscals, and making sure that we redirect some of those savings into investments in much needed infrastructure and in the social sector. The second one, and to also improve the targeting of those energy subsidies for those who actually really need them. The second strategic lever that we're trying to pull is really around the restoration and growth of oil and gas, which remains a critical element of our ability to earn foreign exchange in the short term and our ability to to grow our fiscal income. So the strategic lever there is to make sure we restore the production to the levels that they were before, and grow them and the associated fiscal income from that sector. The third piece is leveraging our gas as our energy transition fuel to diversify our economy and make sure that we displace diesel, PMS, heavier hydrocarbons in the use of various end uses, whether that's in electricity, whether that's in transportation, whether that's making sure that we add more value to that gas via gas-based industries and exporting from that, displacing it in heavy transport, like I said, and also clean cooking, making sure that we enable our energy transition and diversify our economy leveraging that gas. The last piece is really making sure that we are able to industrialize by growing the reliability of our on-grid electricity. And the key focus for the administration is really how to resolve the financial liquidity challenges in that sector to ensure that we're able to attract much needed private sector capital to that sector.
I mean, looking at the second lever, I think it was really around getting our production back to where it was. As you know, it's almost an existential thing for Nigeria if oil production is not where it's meant to be, because we depend so much on it. The government has an ambitious target, and ambitious, I think, is an understatement, because at the end of last year, I think we were maybe at around 1.5, 1.6, but the target is really to get Nigeria to 4 million barrels a day by 2030. From where we are now, that's over a 200% increase. And then to increase gas production by 20% or thereabouts.
Yes.
How are we realistically going to get there?
Well, as you said, it's an ambitious target, but it's grounded in data.
Okay.
So let's take a step back to where we were during even the campaign or when the president assumed office. We're about 1.2 million barrels. Yes, you're right. At the end of last year, we were averaging 1.5, but we did hit a high of 1.8 at some point. The average for January under the NUPRC numbers, condensate and crude, is about 1.73.
That's January 2025.
January 2025.
Right, okay.
So in less than 2 years, we've grown 500,000 barrels. So if we continue to do some of the things that we're trying to do, which are the main issues around security, and deploying a data-driven approach where we collaborate with the Office of the National Security Advisor and Ministry of Defense, work very closely and collaborate with the operators that actually manage that infrastructure, get data around where they need specific intervention. I think we will continue to see those gains. One of the things that you saw was that the terminal factor for one of the, when we deployed that sort of strategy, we saw on the Trans-Niger pipeline, in the eastern part, it's a major truck line in the eastern part. We took this approach and said, let's try it out on the Trans-Niger pipeline. Terminal factor when we assumed office was about 10%. At the end of last year, it was close to 90% by working very closely with the National Security Advisor, the operators, and the Ministry of Defense. In addition to that, you have, in addition to making sure you're very data-driven and very targeted about how you approach security, that you are also engaging the deployment of the host community fund and making sure that the much-needed development is being deployed into those communities so that people have an alternative as opposed to attacking pipelines. So that two-pronged approach, we're seeing it yield outcomes. Yeah, you can actually measure and see that outcome. And I think the second piece is really understanding that we needed to stem the decline in investments. Okay. Some of that was driven by the security issues, but also we were not an attractive destination for capital. And so we've taken a look at some of the presidential directives that were aimed at making us a lot more attractive as a destination for capital. First one was mainly a fiscal incentive and saying, what do we need to make sure that we are a top destination for non-associated gas investments? PIA has done something, but there is still some work to be done. And so we've looked at that and made sure that as of last year, within a few months of releasing those incentives in February 2024, a few months later, Total and NNPC took an investment decision on a non-associated gas field. So that's a direct correlation between making sure that you're able to grow production. That's a $550 million investment. That's critical for our ability to meet our onshore targets for gas production. We have to unlock non-associated gas because 76% of our remaining reserves are in non-associated gas. So those incentives now make sure that we're now a top 3 destination globally in terms of fiscal attractiveness. Yeah. The other piece that we needed to unlock was the fact that our costs for the cost of delivering projects is usually around, if you look globally and regionally, it's supposed to be around $20 per barrel for BOE. We are almost double that. So we needed to take a very close look at the main drivers, again, taking a very data-driven approach, but also sitting down with the operators and understanding their numbers, modeling, benchmarking. And we found certain things to be a major issue. One of them was the fact that we needed to eliminate middlemen who were increasing the cost of local, the execution element of our contracts that allowed you to have, for the local content piece, that law was being abused, and we had a few briefcase businessmen who were driving up costs without local capacity. And we wanted to make sure that that law was actually being used in the way it was intended to do, which is to make sure that we have Nigerian entrepreneurs who have invested in capacity, who win these jobs and are able to execute competitively without necessarily having to go through middlemen, and make sure we could reduce our costs. We think that's about 50% of that 40% premium that we saw in Nigerian costs. And there are a few other issues that we needed to resolve as well, security being one of them.
Yes. Well, I mean, looking at all this, some would say, well, this sounds all well and good. When you look at some of the security and operational challenges in the Delta, is it a case of we're still just addressing the symptoms of insecurity or the operational challenges and not the underlying fundamentals? You talked about the host community fund. There are long-standing inequities or perceptions of inequity. Fundamentally, how do you hope to address those things over the long term? Because if we ramp up production, we need to sustain that over the long term if we're going to get to 4 million barrels a day by 2030.
Absolutely. No, you're right. You have to go to the root causes. And the root causes are the lack of activity and lack of investments. Over the last 10 years meant unemployment shot up in the Niger Delta. Poverty increased in the Niger Delta. Predominantly there because, fabrication yards, catering services, what Port Harcourt and Warri used to be. This used to be major economic hubs. But because investments dried up, there were less opportunities. And we have a restive youth population. So part of what we decided to do is make sure that we unlock the investments that allow those opportunities and employment opportunities to return to the Niger Delta. So that people have economic opportunities and better alternatives than hacking into pipelines.
Right.
If someone has a job to go to, they don't. It's very difficult to recruit them to undertake some of these very dangerous activities in the Niger Delta, lucrative as it may be. So that's definitely an important piece of it. I think the fact that we are also transitioning to local independence onshore, because some of these investments are enabling us to make sure we can differentiate between the IOC strategies and the local independence. Sure. Local independence they have an ability to figure out how to deploy more tailor-made, homemade solutions to those communities. How do we create investment opportunities, host community funds, that we're deploying investments and engaging and making sure that we have solutions that enable opportunities for those communities in a much more sustainable manner. I believe that we are going to be able to leverage the independents who have much more close affinity and understand some of these the solutions that are going to be required there, while the IOCs move their high-powered capital and technical expertise to the offshore and non-associated
offshore. Yes, we've certainly seen that shift and the emergence of local capacity over many, many years. And I guess the question for you around maybe the local content and local capacity issue, are you happy with the ability, are you confident in the ability of local independence to really fill and plug the gap that's being left by the IOCs onshore, both in terms of really helping to ramp up production and helping the government meet its own goals?
So we see this as the president takes this very seriously. Yeah. So it's the first time that you've seen the regulator spend a lot of time looking through the financial and technical capacity of this of the new buyers or the new acquirers of these assets. It was a very rigorous process. It's the first time that we've brought some international players to help us really define a framework for assessing that.
Okay.
Yeah. So it is critical that they have the ability to do so. Not only that, we are going to be monitoring. It's part of, so you have to think of it as a license to operate. Not only for on the regulatory side and what we are going to be monitoring. We set targets. We say you have to deploy capital. This is our production target. We evaluate your capacity and your ability to deliver, whether it's technical expertise, enter into the relative, financial arrangements or technical arrangements or partnerships that allow you to help us meet that target. We look into your portfolio and the reserves and set those targets and monitor it very closely. The NUPRC is spending quite a bit of its time doing that going forward. It's a different approach. It's very different from the way we used to operate and from the previous acquisitions. The second piece is that, yes, I do think they can fill in some of those gaps. The capital required, the onshore is a much more mature basin, much easier to execute. It's also a terrain that these people, that a lot of the acquirers understand. They've operated, a few of them have operated in these environments successfully for decades, so it's not unfamiliar territory to them. They know these areas quite well, and they know these communities quite well as well. They know that they will not be able to operate those assets if they do not share the benefits of those resources with those communities going forward. And so they live here. So they have to really work very closely with those communities to deliver. I believe they can on the onshore side.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the social license is just as important as the operational license to operate. But speaking of capital, just looking again, maybe a final question around the production targets, the deep offshore. I would say, if anything, that is, in a sense, the breadbasket for ramping up production, also just in terms of the amount of reserves and capacity they're going into the future. It was maybe the first FID in 10 years. was
over
taken
10 years.
Over 10 years.
Yeah, last one was
taken
2013.
last year, 2024, not since 2013.
Yes.
So clearly there was something very wrong in the industry if there was no single first investment decision that was taken on any project in an oil-producing country like Nigeria for over 10 years. There was something very seriously wrong. Under your oversight and the oversight of the president, obviously Nigeria achieved this, that was great. But going forward, the deep offshore is so critical to what IOCs want to do in the season. What is going to help us unlock the full potential of Nigeria's deep offshore projects?
A few of the things that we've addressed through the executive order. So let me start by saying that the president took this, he's a super analytical mind, right? So very early, it became quite obvious that this was this sector was so strategic to our short-term and our medium long-term ambitions, whether it's around fiscals or And so he personally has sat with more, I don't know if you've been keeping count of how many IOCs he's met and how many operators he's met. Any opportunity to sit with them and ask them what they need for Nigeria to be competitive, and so for them to return to Nigeria and deploy their capital here. He's taken that very seriously, and he's met with almost everyone at least twice.
Right.
Yeah,
All the IOCs.
All of the IOCs. Their international leadership. Anytime they ask to meet him, he makes himself available. So he takes it very seriously, and he sits with them, tries to understand what those issues are, and so that tone set from the top has really helped. Yeah. For the deep water, you're right, because in order to reach that very ambitious target of 4 million, the independents are very critical to our short-term targets, and they can help us on the onshore. But the medium and long-term targets of that 4 million, you have to do it with deep water. There's no other way around it. So in sitting with those operators, we asked what was required, and we analyzed what was required. And very quickly, we knew that fiscal incentives needed to be unlocked and improved for us to be much more competitive for our large oil accumulations as well as our small oil accumulations. We needed to eliminate a lot of the bureaucracies that led to long project execution timelines, whether that's contracting processes and things like and other things like that. The stability and clarity of the regulatory framework between the two regulators were other things that they identified, and obviously the cost structure. Because Bonga checked a few of these things, the cost was much more competitive and closer to what IOCs are seeing elsewhere. Because the fiscals made sure that we were one of the top destinations to put capital, to deploy capital, and that they saw the progress that they hadn't seen. The president selected some of these projects as his blueprint projects to execute, to drive the implementation of those executive orders. It signals something. It signaled something to a lot of these IOCs. And also, it was and the fact that we were able to drive that execution and that implementation because of the strategic direction very clearly set by the president, meant that everyone, whether it was NUPRC, FIRS, the Ministry of Finance, and MPC, all collaborated to make sure that we executed within. So for the first time, you had deep offshore incentives for non-associated gas. We've never had that. And that the fiscal incentives that we designed were implemented in Bonga and any other projects that are lined up. And so you saw Shell respond. Investors respond to incentives. They do.
Yeah, indeed.
And especially because we're such an established domain. The resources are here. You would rather take the reserves that you know are there in Nigeria versus going to explore in Namibia.
So you're not worried about competition with other offshore basins around the world?
Oh, we are. That's why we're very much. So if you look at the way we designed our incentives, it's because we took a very competitive approach.
So a global approach.
We benchmarked ourselves to our regional peers. We benchmarked ourselves to our global peers and said, what are the others doing that is making we looked at over the last 10 years, we saw 80 billion go elsewhere. Same operators in our markets, we deployed 80 billion in other markets. We looked at those markets and really studied what they did differently and where we fell short, and we tried to close those gaps.
So we've had 5 major asset acquisitions. I think I don't remember a time in the history of me studying the oil and gas sector when we've had so many asset acquisitions in such a short space of time. So I guess as Nigerians, our expectation is that 2.06 million barrel a day target that the budget has will be met, because we have all these assets changing hands and we have local players who have the capacity to deliver, right? Are you confident, first of all, that we will meet that budget target of 2.06 million barrels a day for 2025? And can you then also tell us a bit about why some of those approvals on the acquisitions by local players took so long?
Okay, so I think the 2 million barrel per day target is ambitious, and we are not, if there's something that has now been established over the last 18 to 19 months, is that it's a very ambitious government and an administration, but we also try to deliver as close to that stretch target as possible. So 2 million barrels, as I said, we've grown 500,000 since we came in, close to 500,000. So you need to grow another 200K per barrel if you look at the January average. Let's be clear that 2 million barrels also includes condensate.
Right.
So that is sometimes people think that it's just a crude number, but it's crude and condensate that we are hoping will average around 2 million barrels per day. In January, the NUPRC numbers show that we've averaged 1.73, so we're not too far off, provided a few conditions are met, obviously. One, that these acquisitions, that there is a safe transition between the IOCs and the new acquirers, and a very seamless transition at that, and that we are pretty confident that that the President has granted consent in his capacity as the Honorable Minister to people who have the technical and financial capacity to grow production. Two of those acquisitions are going to be critical to our ability to meet that 2 million barrel per day target. The SPDC Renaissance transition is critical. The CEPLAT ExxonMobil transition will be very critical. Those are massive assets that we are hoping will deliver significant, maybe half of that production, the 200,000 gap that we're looking at for this year.
And the SPDC Renaissance was in the news so much. Why did that approval take quite a while? It seemed like, to the layman looking at it on the outside, there was just this back and forth. There was a lot of speculation. What is going on? Are there assets that are too big to change hands in Nigeria? What was the issue? Help us understand and unpack that bit.
So I think when people say it took long, I think I look at the Exxon transaction that we inherited, and I look at the speed at which the other transactions that are within the life of this administration that started from ministerial consent within the life of this administration, which are the 4 orders. I think granting those consents within the same calendar year is a record for us as a country. Again, data. Right. So it took long. It took a bit longer, and you should scrutinize. I think it's in our national interest to scrutinize such a strategic acquisition. SPDC has operated, Shell as the parent company has operated onshore since 1938. They were sitting on, it was about 16 licenses that needed to move from one licensee to the other. You needed to make sure this was a skill that had never been done before. So the rigor, a regulatory rigor that needed to be applied to make sure that we were handing this over to the right people who understood what the national objectives were around growing production as quickly as possible, as we talked about earlier, how important that is for this government. Who have the financial and technical capacity. That requires rigor, that requires a level of interrogation and comfort and assurances that were required. And I still think that was done within a reasonable time frame. Compared to our previous transactions that seem arbitrary, or some of our decisions, we wanted to make sure that this didn't seem arbitrary. We wanted to make sure we learned from our past where assets were handed over to certain operators that did not have the financial or technical capacity to grow production in line with the national objectives. And so within the time frame that it was done, which was within the same calendar year, I think 5 in a year, including the one that was hanging before this administration started, is a record.
Yeah, and I mean, now that you mention that, my mind goes back to the 2014 assets, marginal fields, and a lot of where many of those operators got stuck or the acquirers got stuck was on the funding.
Correct.
And the financing.
Correct.
So is it safe to assume that that was one of the critical areas you looked at with the decision making at government level? Absolutely,
because if you've set an ambitious target of 4 million, the operators that are going to be holding these assets and executing your overall strategy, you need to be sure that they have the technical and financial capacity to do so.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess finally on the asset acquisition, Nigerians are I guess the average Nigerian feels like they own the oil and gas sector because it's so important to us as a people. So what sort of commitment or guarantee that can the government give around scrutiny of these types of deals? What has changed fundamentally about the way the administration is looking at this so that it's seen to be above board when it comes to scrutinizing assets that are changing hands in such a strategic sector?
I think we've done a great job of making sure that our regulatory environment, our legal environment, and especially on the policy side, that we're very consistent, transparent, and stable.
Right.
So when we say we want to evaluate people's technical capacity there are certain criteria that we try to make sure. Again, it's not perfect. Rome wasn't built in a day. We're constantly learning and engaging on ways to improve. But the intent is to be as transparent and as clear as possible, so that we are developing an environment that fosters investment and confidence compared to other areas. For the average Nigerian, they can be sure that what keeps this president up is making sure that every resource that is within Nigeria's territory delivers value for every Nigerian. And making sure that we have the right legal framework, the right regulatory framework, the right policies that enable the investments in a much more consistent and stable manner.